You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 16th of July, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The Republican National Convention threatens to make the ear bandage a fashion accessory. Germany decides that it has read enough of one far-right journal, and should Danish politicians and arguably everybody else get off social media? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Isabel Hilton and Yossi Meckelberg will discuss today's big stories, and we'll hear from the Atlantic Council's Adrian Karatnitsky about his new book chronicling modern Ukraine's efforts to establish its independence, despite the best efforts of its resentful neighbour. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, international journalist, visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute and founder of China Dialogue, and by Yossi Meckelberg, associate fellow at Chatham House and a lecturer in international relations at the University of Roehampton. I think you are the two regular panellists with the longest job descriptions.
Sorry about that.
Bad idea having you both on the same show. That's all we've got time for. Thanks for listening. Yossi, you have recently been travelling, as you very often seem to Japan in this instance.
Yeah, it was kind of first Japan, then the States, but Japan was quite special. It was my first visit there, so it made it very special, but especially going to Hiroshima, one of these places that you hear all your life about it for all the wrong reasons. And there was a meeting there, a workshop about disarmament, nuclear disarmament. Very much supported by the governor of Hiroshima. And thinking about the world, I know it's not something that's going to happen immediately, a world without nuclear. And it was interesting, to be in this place, to go to the Peace Memorial park and museum, and to see the famous dome that survived the terrible nuclear bomb. But at the same time, when you're in the discussion, you felt there is those who think, we should think about the world without mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. But there's people think, we can replace it with something else, which then it starts worrying you. Maybe AI can give you, it will be without radiation, but will be probably as terrible. So between the two, thinking about actually maybe a world more peaceful, and when it's probably one of the most poignant moments was meeting with a 91-year survivor. She was 12 at the time, lost most of her family. And, when you meet them and how they overcome, which is kind of something very Japanese. Yes, that's what happened. And then it was followed by very pacifist movement in Japan. But the question, through translate said, one thing I'll tell you, nuclear is bad.
Isabel, this is a reach as a pivot from one recent travel experience to another goes, but you were doing something, he said, grinding the gears audibly here, vaguely associated with Japan in some respect?
Indeed. Well, yes, it's not, it's certainly closer and in less iconic in a way, but actually it's pretty iconic. I went to Stratford-on-Avon, home of the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Which is not in Japan.
It's not in Japan, but I went to see a absolutely wonderful play about the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, you may find this hard to believe.
My eyebrow is arching sceptically.
How do you make a compelling drama about the negotiation of a UN treaty? Believe me, they've done it. And of course, the story is the resistance from the evil representative of petrochemical industry, and the many people with their national interests. And it actually took you absolutely into the negotiation process, which was a total cliffhanger, and saved by an Argentine chair who thereafter, he'd made so many enemies that the only way he could get to the next conference of the parties was as a chauffeur.
What is the name of this play that drew you to the edge of your seat?
Kyoto. As in the Kyoto Protocol.
And that is playing now in Stratford-upon-Avon?
It has just closed in Stratford-upon-Avon, but we are hoping that it will come to London for next summer for London Climate Action Week, and you'll be able to see it. OK,
well, we will start tonight's show in the United States at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. It was the focus of even more interest and or aghast curiosity than it might have been, representing as it does former President Donald Trump's first public appearance since narrowly surviving an assassination attempt on Saturday, and the anointing of his vice presidential running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, a former Trump skeptic who, for some unfathomable reason, has recently rethought his previously adumbrated opinion that anyone considering voting for Trump was, and this is a direct quote, an idiot. Isabel, what can imaginably have changed J.D. Vance's mind?
I simply can't imagine. But he's clearly a man who values flexibility above almost any other human characteristic.
Ideologically malleable.
Yeah, I mean, he did ask memorably if Trump was America's Hitler. I mean, the list of quotes from J.D. Vance about Trump is pretty impressive.
I mean, it's arguable that this does seem to reveal a hitherto unseen forgiving side to Donald Trump.
Yes, possibly, although he may have been influenced by the fact that J.D. Vance, who wrote a book about his own, tough childhood and has influence in the swing states, might be helpful on the ticket. So that could be it. Also, J.D. Vance has come into line not only on the question of whether Trump is the next, is America's Hitler, but he used to be a great proponent of climate action, and that seems to have gone into reverse too. It's now drill, baby, drill, and let's make America a 1950s petrostate again.
Is he going to be a different kind of vice president for Trump should Trump be re-elected in November, Yossi? Because obviously last time round it was Mike Pence who, again, for some unfathomable reason, has neither put himself forward nor been asked on this occasion. But the deal that time round seemed to be that Mike Pence is governor of Indiana, obviously maybe a bit weird, but a relatively normal politician who operates within recognised parameters of reality, whereas is J.D. Vance more the... Well, he weirdly seems like the bad cop in this arrangement.
Yeah, and I think there is a bit of a paradigm shift here. Taking someone much younger, which I think when the issue of age is really reading in American elections, things that, all right, if something happens, you have a younger version, almost, you say about the bad cop, a version of me, but maybe even worse when it comes. By the way, compare not only said, is it a Nixon or is it a Hitler? So that's the kind of the comparison that he made of Trump. But
Vance is the youngest major party vice presidential nominee since Richard Nixon, and that turned out fine.
Completely fine, yes. Considering how the Nixon presidency ended, if this is the criteria, maybe this is the case. But the idea that you take someone that, again, you mentioned about it's not about, you would like to see politicians that are flexible, intellectually flexible, and can change their mind. This think about something more about their spine being very flexible here with their ideology when the offered place. First, he changed his mind about Trump when he wanted to become a senator, and now when becoming, the vice president or potentially the vice president, it's an issue in American. It's not over there. Actually been to Wyoming, and there the Congress when there she changed her mind because she ran against Liz Cheney at the time, and from a critic of Trump saying horrible thing about Trump, said here is an opportunity to become the only Congress nominee in the state, a very small state. And then they change their mind. And you think, really, are there any principle in American politics and either standing to any ideology or give me the job and I'll say whatever Trump wants me to say?
Isabel, the idea that Vance is being hauled aboard as Trump's preferred successor will be causing an amount of nervousness among the United States NATO allies and something possibly akin to outright panic in Ukraine, because Trump so far has hedged somewhat on Ukraine while seeming vaguely unenthused, and I don't think his personal dislike of Volodymyr Zelensky is any great secret. Vance is a out and proud to hell with Ukrainer, basically.
Yes, he's going to push. I mean, if he has any influence beyond Trump, and who knows? I mean, actually, being Trump's vice president it's a bit of a nightmare because you never know what the man's going to do next.
Famously, being anybody's vice president
Indeed.
is a bit of a nightmare.
But Trump probably not sure too further up the scale. But at least the positions he's taken yesterday or today, take Trump's position much further. So he is very pro-Putin. He is completely against any kind of external engagement of US forces or US money. I mean, he has basically said we should be spending the money at home, not in Ukraine, and to hell with it. So that's two of them. There won't be any moderating influence on Trump, as we clearly can see. The plan is not to have any moderating influence, and this is an example of it. So a lot of concern.
Interesting subplot at the RNC as well. Just before we move off this, Yossi, and I think at least it's in keeping with putting J.D. Vance on the ticket. This is doubling down on pitching to the white working classes, possibly because the Trumpists realise they don't have anybody else. But the actual Teamsters president, Sean O'Brien, was invited to speak at the RNC. I believe the first union boss ever to be invited to speak at the RNC, and the Teamsters of all people. Now, he didn't, as I understand it, specifically endorse Trump, and he may not. But he was not only given the spot to speak, he was allowed to speak at some length and was heard in respectful silence.
Yeah, and he's not a supporter of Trump, and definitely the 1.3 million people that he represents, not necessarily supporters of Trump. But this is, again, the attempt to attract the working class in the United States to support Trump, though we know that he's not going to represent them when he is in power, because he is going to represent the big businesses. We talked about the energy businesses, the oil, the gas. So in this sense, are they going to support Trump? You look at labor laws in the United States that compared to the EU, when it comes to, as they call it, vacation, when it comes to health, when it comes to long hours, Trump is not going to be a friend of the trade unions there. So they listen to him. They think by giving a stage, especially when we have some of the swing states, they would like some of the white working class to support, because this will make the change. But if they think straight, at the end of the day, nothing of this is going to improve the condition. They are anti-globalization, they're anti-the war, for instance, in Ukraine, foreign war involvement. So this is actually going to harm democracy, and with harming democracy is also the rights of workers. So it was nice that he was given a stage. Cleverly, they donate to both parties, $45,000 to each of the parties, hedging their bets. But at the end of the day, most of them probably won't vote for Trump.
Well, to Germany now, where subscribers to Compact magazine should brace for disappointment. Compact, for those who've not had the pleasure, is a periodical catering to Germany's far right and maintains a general editorial tone which makes Der Stürmer look like railway modeller. Compact is unkeen on Jews, Muslims, foreigners in general, and much more enthused about the prospect of overthrowing the modern German state and establishing the sort of prelapsarian Aryan homeland which worked out so well for everyone last time round. Compact has been canned on the instruction of Germany's Interior Minister, Nancy Faeser. Yossi, she calls it taking action against intellectual arsonists. I think the word intellectual might be doing some lifting there. Where are we on this? Obviously, I don't think we need to spend much time debating whether or not Compact is a savoury or otherwise journal, but nevertheless, should it be banned?
Yes, you might argue that I might have vested interest in this kind of in this kind of newspaper and what they stand for. There is a real debate in democracy. How much we let freedom of speech go beyond certain lines, and I think they're probably crossing when you thought Germany for Germans. We heard this before.
We know what they mean.
We know exactly what it means. Anyone that is not Aryan basically shouldn't be there. You see that the Alternative for Deutschland doing well in election. So on the one hand, we don't want to panic and to actually by banning, for instance, this kind of publication, we give them more publicity than they deserve. On the other, if we let it, fester, we normalize it, we legitimize this kind of language, and different from the Stürmer that they are kind of more equal in hating everyone that is not German. They don't.
That would be a bold defense if they tried it.
Yeah, I know. So they hate Muslims. They hate everyone that doesn't look like
people.
that. Yeah, for instance. But there is something that it's a very fine line in a democracy, and sometimes, yes, we'll see what's the reaction to that. One of the things that we have to be cognizant, we don't want to drive them underground. Because especially in the era of social media, is that sometimes you want it in the open, you can debate and you can follow it, instead when you're driving them underground. But it's a tough call.
I mean, that is one argument, the driving them underground argument, and there's the associated argument with, given the online realm, is there actually any point in banning a print magazine anyway? But, Isabel, there's also a question, I think, there's the question that we have just been discussing about, freedom of speech and should we allow people to communicate stuff even if we disagree with it and don't like it. But is there also maybe an argument of expedience, as in, if this allows a relatively small number of angry morons to blow off some steam, should we just let them write their magazine and circulate it?
Well, no doubt there's a case for it, but I'm quite surprised it's lasted this long, because Germany, of all countries, for rather obvious reasons, has a more limited tolerance of far-right propaganda than other countries, and there are things that are specifically against the law. Promotion of far-right ideology or neo-Nazi ideology is already against the law in Germany. So I think they've been slightly indulging, and maybe it's the fact that the rise of the right has become so evident since the European elections and the rise of the right in Germany, but also across Europe, that they have thought maybe we've been a little too indulgent. 40,000 subscribers, it's not a lot.
It's not nothing, though.
It's not nothing,
I mean,
but
there are a great many print magazines who'd be delighted with
to have
that.
40,000, that's true. But Germany is a big country. A lot of people live there. And I think to tolerate it is a signal that it's sort of okay in some way, and I'm not sure that it is okay.
Yossi, there's also the problem in tackling something like this with these measures that all crackpots and cranks of this sort, including the most obvious ideological forebears of compact, trade on a persecution narrative. They're out to get us. They want to stop us. They don't want us to be who we are. And the thing is, when you send the state to close down their magazine and send the cops round to the editor's house, it kind of reinforces the persecution narrative.
Yeah, and this is kind of the playbook of all of them. The stab in the back, going back. And again, it's about where is the critical mass of all of that? Is 40,000, it's a lot, or it's little and we don't know? But, Hitler started in a small pub in Munich, and it gathered momentum given the right conditions. So it starts with education. It starts with dialogue within society. Why we should reject this kind of opinion, especially in the 21st century, and especially Germany with its experience of 1933 and 1945 should know more than any other country where it all leads. But this is part of the discourse in society. So I think, not that I know exactly how you balance all of this, but between, on the one hand, not to push the panic button, but at the same time, not to dismiss it, it's too little. You need to deal with that to see more than what they are, why they appeal to 40,000 people, why the editor of this magazine has 350,000 following on YouTube. So we need to go back to the root causes, why it appeals to them, and not what's the end result, that there's the fellowship. And that's what we are not good at. What scares, for instance, Germans, and what scares people, for instance, here, and we see a certain party winning 14% of the vote. what scares the people to vote them, not the one that are mouthpiece of this kind of extreme ideologies.
Isabel, is this also one of those things where there will always be a row or there will always be uncertainty, because it's not really possible to draw up one list of hard and fast rules that serve as a universal template for everything? I think we're in the realm of that I think it was an American judge's definition of pornography, that you know it when you see it.
Yes. Would your wife and servant be? Would you show it to your wife and servant? As
definitely a British judge who said that.
But of course, and I think. Look, I think she's absolutely right. A lot of it's about education. Remember, Donald Trump said how much he loved the poorly educated. It was the poorly educated who had elected him, as he said. And the poorly educated, the people who have political and economic problems that are not being addressed. I mean, we see the result. They're offered a dog to kick and they kick it, and that's not good. It doesn't solve their problem, and it makes a lot of people suffer. So I think that I have no problem with the idea that you close down a publication that blames all of Germany's problems on non-Germans and calls itself the voice of resistance. And the voice of resistance to what exactly?
This is all sounding vaguely familiar.
Indeed,
yes.
It is. Yeah.
Well, we'll move along somewhat, and for depressingly obvious reasons, relations between the United States and Russia may enjoy a renaissance from early next year, should the Kremlin's preferred ticket prevail this November. One Russian firm, however, is not sticking around to see what happens. The antivirus colossus Kaspersky Labs is folding its American tent after its software was banned in the US. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo declaring that Kaspersky was unacceptably close to the Russian regime. Kaspersky, in the great Russian tradition, denies everything. Isabel, there's an overlapping question here, I think, with your particular bailiwick, i.e. China. Have we reached the point, or indeed past the point, at which all Western countries should be basically suspicious of all Russian and Chinese tech firms?
I think we're basically there, because the kind of the level of trust that we used to have maybe a decade ago, born out of globalization and a kind of mistaken, as it turns out, impression that everyone was playing by the same rules, that's gone. I mean, the Kaspersky case goes back a bit. It goes back to 2017, as far as I'm aware, when they were accused of hacking into or stealing confidential data from a US NSA agency contractor. So it's not the first time, but I think that the suspicions have been growing, and it does seem anomalous, to be honest, that you would have given what we know about Russia's digital behavior, that you would have Russian antivirus software freely operating in your country. It's been banned from government use in several countries, not just the United States. And I think it's a reasonable suspicion, as it is with Chinese software, that there is no meaningful separation between a major company and state security. After all, cable and wireless used to pretty much operate in conjunction with British security when they were, back in the days of the telegraph. So it's not a new thing. It's a thing that, you have a critical communications sector, the government takes an interest. And of course they do.
I mean, Yossi, it's a bit like the previous story. It is that question of at what point, literally in this case, do you pull the plug? But does it seem weird, if they've taken this action against Kaspersky Labs, that TikTok is still perfectly permitted to flourish in the United States? Or is it just that thing that the Biden administration understands that if you really want to tank the youth vote, that's the way to do that?
Well, I think an antivirus company, it's different, because it's two sides of this coin. If you know how to stop viruses,
you know how to plant them.
You know how to plant them as well, or you know how to enter into computers, which TikTok as such is not. It's a different thing how you influence. But the idea that you have a company like this operating in the United States and can enter into computers or can plant viruses, that's different, especially now before election, and we know the influence in 2016, for instance, of Russian social media and the rest. So there is a balance. On the one hand, we all enter into the age of globalization. We thought it's great that companies can operate anywhere. It doesn't matter. And as Thomas Friedman put it, it's flat. The world is flat. So as a result of it, we can operate everywhere economically, and it makes us all richer. But then came the other side of it, and with the security, example with China, for instance, when China, for instance, offered kindly to help the port in Haifa, in Israel, then because the Sixth Fleet of the United States tend to dock there, said, we have an issue with that, because they might listen to certain things that we don't want them to hear. So between actually national security and globalization and the commercial, especially when they are too close to government, and we know that governments can, at certain points, force them to do certain things or pressurize to do them, you need to balance again between the two.
Isabel, is there an arguable analogue here between the scramble to detach from Russian energy we've seen in the last couple of years? Because with all due acknowledgement that I have no idea how any of this stuff works, it does strike me as incredible that we're expected to believe that it is beyond the wit of any American or European company to come up with something akin to either Kaspersky antivirus or TikTok.
Well, indeed. I mean, Kaspersky antivirus, there are any number of antivirus companies. It's not particularly well known. It's not a particular consumer product. But of course there are. This is not an exclusive skill, and I find it fairly extraordinary that it should have operated quite as long as it has. TikTok is different for reasons we've discussed. It's been, it's about influence. Though India banned it and the sky did not fall, people simply moved over to another version of short videos, and there are many now available. I think there's something particularly attractive about the TikTok algorithm, which I can't speak to. But actually, if you're looking to make short videos and distribute them, there are plenty of places you can do it. I think that from the consumer perspective in the States, it would be difficult to do out of the clear blue sky. It happened in India after there was a particularly unpleasant border clash in which quite a substantial number of Indian soldiers had been killed. And they simply banned all Chinese social media overnight, and that was it. And people just sort of blinked in the sunshine and looked around for alternatives.
Well, on that subject, or a subject akin to it, to Denmark, where a think tank report has taken a pop at Denmark's politicians for wasting time on social media instead of attending to their constituents. An unnamed current MP is quoted in the report as harumphing that very few members of Parliament actually do what they're supposed to be doing, that is, sitting down and reading legislation with a critical eye and understanding what it is they are legislating. Though with due acknowledgement that Denmark is one of Earth's better organised jurisdictions, more than one listener elsewhere may feel that they'd actually be happier if their MP was online trading cat pictures all day instead of attempting to govern. Yossi, politicians on social media, should they do it or should they not? And if they should, then how?
I think this goes back to all this idea, the origin of social media. At the beginning, we thought it's great, it's going back to the town square, direct democracy. We all engage with one another in a civilized manner. And oops.
This was the view of people who had never read more than 3 pages of a history book in their entire lives.
And then, it hit us that this is not the case, including politicians. And you read some of what they put there and said, yeah, maybe they should concentrate on serving their constituents. Yes, they look at legislation and make sure that oversee a government's activity. So part of it, as you can see, is engagement with the constituents. It's fine. Hearing what they say, conveying messages. But when they spend most of the time there and actually fighting instead of spending time in parliaments and fighting with one another on Twitter, on any other social media, probably this Danish think tank is quite right.
My concern, and this is actually me attempting, Isabel, to insert an actually serious concern into the conversation. And I have had this conversation with politicians who do talk about this being a problem, that if you are a politician with any profile at all, you can post the most innocuous thing you can possibly think of on social media. Merry Christmas to all my constituents. You can congratulate a colleague or even an opposition MP on their wedding or the birth of a child. Almost all the responses you will generate are insane. angry, raving nonsense, possibly not even from actual people. And my concern is, and I've spoken to a couple of certainly MPs in this country who've said, yeah, you do find yourself having to go to actual mental effort not to internalise the idea that this is the electorate. You have to remind yourself that most people are not like this. Most people just don't respond. If I say Merry Christmas to all my constituents, the responses I get tend to be from maniacs.
But I think what that is an argument for is, why are they doing it themselves? What are assistants for? I think I worked in organisations where the social media is run by someone who knows how to run social media. That you don't really expect the president or the CEO to write their own tweets. There's somebody who just does it. And don't look at it. It really, I learned quite early on when I was writing a column for a British newspaper, and they opened up, but right at the beginning of encouraging responses, they made me put my email address at the bottom. I cannot tell you the vile stuff that came in. And if you replied to it, you've sometimes got quite a sheepish response, but they just fired off quite dreadful stuff.
See, I found that a direct email, and I'm easy enough to find, but you tend to get, and I do actually grant, I know this does make a difference. I'm not a woman, so I get less unpleasant abuse than I think a female in my position would. But I've tended to find that people who email you directly on the assumption that you might actually read it do tend to be a lot more civil, by and large.
And if you respond, then they are often more civil. They don't tend to maintain the hostility.
I've also had the thing where I have replied to an initially hostile message and got this swift response. Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
You're a human being. Exactly. Yes, I forgot. But I do think that it is a waste of politicians' time. They are there to do a job. They shouldn't be doing the social media. If they feel that it's necessary for profile, that it's necessary because it exists, get someone else to do it in your name.
I mean, Yossi, have you seen any that have used it effectively? And by effectively, I don't mean attract a lot of attention to themselves and bolster their own fortunes. And I honestly think there is no imaginable way Donald Trump would ever have got elected anything without social media. But have you seen examples of politicians who do actually use it constructively, like as a means of getting things done?
Not just getting things done, but actually... we complained for many years that the public is apathetic about politics. And there is actually an opportunity through social media to disseminate knowledge about, for instance, it's a piece of legislation, it's a piece, policy. Get some. So in many cases, as you say one thing and the reaction to this is completely on different issue and insane. But on occasion, you see politicians that talk about or tweet something or put on Facebook and any other or TikTok, something which is relevant actually to constituency. And then going back to education is to develop. It's still relatively young way, a new way of communicating with people on a mass scale is also, yes, we put something that is out there to debate, but we also expect the other side to reply in a way which is constructive. And that's the idea. But you see politicians that put, whether it's legislation or other policies that actually can be relevant for debate. So it's a process, and we need to move with the idea, okay, I'll put something serious and something just things I can abuse as much as I like.
Finally, on today's show, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was not some sudden whim. It followed months of ostentatious build-up and indeed the earlier assault of 2014. And those followed years of simmering Russian resentment at Ukraine's independent statehood, acquired in 1991. A new book by Adrian Karatnitsky, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, traces the escalating tensions over those decades by charting the courses steered by Ukraine's post-independence presidents, some of whom he knows personally. The book is called Battleground Ukraine, From Independence to the War with Russia. I spoke to Adrian about it at Midori House earlier, and I began by asking about the beginnings of his own associations with Ukraine.
Almost by birthright. My family were refugees from Nazi-occupied and Soviet-occupied Poland in various periods in the Second World War. So I grew up in a household that had both Polish ancestry, but primarily Ukrainian ancestry, with a certain kind of a narrative, a kind of an expectation that there is such a thing as a Ukrainian nation, that it has had a tradition of at least autonomy, if not statehood, and that it's natural, and it would be in the natural order of things that Ukraine should be an independent state.
Well, that right there, of course, is the tension at the heart of this conflict. But your narrative starts with around about the independence of Ukraine in 1991. But to reflect on the decades briefly just before that, do you think it's right to say that Ukraine was always a fundamentally reluctant Soviet republic?
I believe it was. It was not noticed by the media, but in 1972, for example, there was a purge of the top leadership of the Ukrainian Politburo, including the General Secretary, on charges of encouraging nationalism. And all he did was promote a kind of a national narrative and try to squeeze out more autonomy. And Brezhnev went after him like a ton of bricks, just kind of, and he was removed from power, exiled to Moscow. Petro Shellist was his name. But this event kind of was lost in reporting. It was one of the great stories that was ignored. But it was a signal that this trend, at the very least, of national communism was latent inside the Ukrainian political discourse, even within the Communist Party.
I mean, the book is structured essentially as a tale of six presidents, those people who've been Ukraine's head of state since independence, several of whom you have known personally. And it is interesting to compare and contrast with the first five and the sixth, because it's a conversation I've had with many Ukrainians over the last couple of years. If it had been anybody but Zelensky in charge in February 2022, might Putin have got what he wanted?
I don't believe so. I mean, I do think that there was always a tension in the orientation of Ukrainian presidents. The first one was, I would say, more oriented to and skeptical of Russia. Then a second president, Kuchma, was balancing between East and West. Then you had, I think, the politics of Ukraine changed fundamentally, and the dispute among the Ukrainian identity and Western orientation versus a kind of a integration with Russia and why can't we all be friends had disappeared by the time that, and I think the annexation of Crimea was the decisive force that moved even the populations of the East and the South in Ukraine, who had traditionally wanted bilingualism, were immersed in Russian state media and were influenced by the Russian narrative.
I mean, the why can't we all be friends question does seem a fairly obvious one to put to this conflict, because obviously, and this is not being said in any means to agree with Vladimir Putin's thesis of some mystical destiny uniting the two peoples, but they are culturally very similar. A great many Ukrainians will have Russian family, Russian friends. A great many Ukrainians, including the president, grew up speaking Russian. I suspect that's going to change for future generations. But to look at that issue not from Russia's side, because that's not what your book's about. Was there anything you think, even in retrospect, that any of the five presidents before Zelensky could have done to forestall what has happened and keep Ukraine in one piece?
Well, I think that that's really the great paradox, what was called multi-vectorism, and this attempt to zigzag between the East and the West was a policy that was followed by the first couple presidents, but it became unsustainable, partly because politicians chose to wage politics as culture wars and identity wars, more so than policy wars. And the reason they did so was that the country was not booming. They had very little to offer the public. So the debates about tax policy or social policy were kind of moot because the resources of the state were strained. So it was very comfortable to kind of play off the Ukrainophone population versus the Russophone population. So I think that created that stickiness in the Ukrainian system. But I do want to respond to the idea that the Ukrainians and Russians are alike. It's disputable because, first of all, the legacy of Ukraine is as much the legacy of being under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, being the legacy. So why aren't Ukrainians thought of as being influenced by Vienna? They were under Polish rule, so we don't think about them as having a kind of an innate connection to Poland. They were under, various the Lithuanian Commonwealth. Yeah. So theoretically, and they lived apart, and certainly right bank Ukraine, which was the bedrock of this national identity was historically much more a European. And very interestingly, even the most pro-Russian of Ukrainian presidents, the discredited, corrupt Viktor Yanukovych, was in dialogue to create a common economic zone with the European Union. And during the time as he was building up to it, he was supporting cultural initiatives that emphasized Ukraine's Europeanness rather than its connection to Russia. So even the most, I would say, Russia-friendly Ukrainian politicians understood that there was a bit of a peril of getting too close to the bear.
As a final thought then, and I am aware even as I ask it that there probably isn't a short answer to this question, but if you could do your best, as you think beyond the period that you've chronicled in the book up until now, more or less, this war will end one day, hopefully sooner rather than later. But do you imagine that this experience will have transformed Ukraine still further, that it will emerge out the other side of this as a different country to the country that went into it?
Well, I do think so. I mean, over time, one prays that Russia will at last lose its imperial caste. But I like to point out that the period that I covered, 1991 to the present day, is roughly 35 years. That's like, for Americans, from 1776 to the War of 1812. And so the law, this desire to recover empire is present in empires, and you try to take a chance whenever you can get it. I think Britain kind of had that last final moment in 1812, and afterwards there were no more similar attempts. And one hopes that if this war is resolved, that there will be a certain kind of an accommodation to the idea that Russia is Russia, and maybe Russia will turn more inward. I'm not saying it'll become democratic, but that is the best option for Ukraine. And that's why Western aid, Western assistance, helping a people that in fact are kind of unified, are more unified than most nations are and than they have ever been, is the best way to kind of create that chance for such an outcome.
That was Adrian Karatnitsky speaking to me earlier. His book, Battleground Ukraine, From Independence to the War with Russia, is available now. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Isabel Hilton and Yossi Meckelberg. The show was produced by Henry Rhys Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Tamsin Howard. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.